Okay, so we'll start from here. Okay.
Sounds good.
Okay, so hi everyone. Today we have Ken Stanley here with us, and we're really glad to see you again, Ken. So last month in June, the Becoming Global Students Association collaborated with the Stanford Life Design Lab in organizing the Life Design in the Era of AI event at Stanford. So many of our students and young professionals were deeply inspired by your talk, Ken. And today we'd love to chat about some of the questions from different perspectives, adding on to the previous event. So our first question is, Ken, can you tell us about your early experiences that sparked your interest in computer science and AI? Were there any specific events or influences that guided you toward this field?
Okay. Yeah. And thanks for having me here. I'm glad to have this chance to talk to everybody. In terms of early influences, I think probably my interest in AI started when um, my my parents bought a computer when I was probably about 8 years old, third grade, basically right before third grade. And for some reason, at that time, 8 years old, what I really found interesting, by the way, it was a Commodore 64, which probably a lot of people haven't even heard of, this in the 1980s. And one of the things about the Commodore 64 that was kind of cool, I think, which might be different than today's computers, is you could write programs into it like immediately as soon as you turned it on. Like the main operating system was a basic programming language interface. There's a language is called BASIC, which is yeah, it's a language that kids especially used to use a lot. And so like I could just start programming immediately as soon as the computer was turned on. And I immediately got interested in the idea that I could program the computer to talk to me. That's like something I really thought about a lot as a little kid. I'm a little kid, but I was thinking I just wanted to have a conversation. And it seemed like it'd be really fun if it would talk to me. And I especially thought it'd be cool if it would say something interesting. Um, but at first I programmed it to do stuff like it would say, and this is all in text. It would write, "Hi, what's your name?" And then I could enter my name, and then it would say, "Hi, Ken," and say, "How are you?" And I say, "Good," or it'd say something like, "Oh, I'm glad you're good." So it's this kind of like scripted conversation, and that was the kind of thing I was programming. And I quickly, realized that it's kind of boring. After the first or second time you talk to it, it's not very interesting. And that's when I started to realize there's like a big issue here, like in terms of like to really be like a person. And I actually thought still at the age of 8 that probably like the solution to this, like if I really want my computer to be able to act like a person, is written somewhere, like it's in some book or maybe a magazine. And I just need to find where the instructions are. Like, how do you write a code to make the computer act like a human? And it took me a while to realize that actually there is no such code. And it's like there is no instructions and no one knows. And this is one of the hardest problems like in the history of the world. And so as I realized that, I started to realize it's actually a really interesting problem. And I got just ever since then, I was interested in how could I make the computer act more like a human.
That's really interesting. So seeing this perspective from growing up as a kid and just having some interactions with the computer, I think that's definitely fascinating. So, and a really interesting point. So my next question is about your approach. So your work kind of emphasizes on the importance of novelty and exploration over the traditional goal-driven approaches. Could you please share like a particular moment that led you to develop this philosophy?
hmm Yeah, so the philosophy really began when we noticed a particularly strange underlying phenomenon in an experimental service that we had put on the internet. Some people might know about it, the pick breeder, depending on how much they've heard me say before. But we had this pick breeder system we had created to allow people to breed pictures online on the web. This is around 15 years ago, something like that. And I had done this with my research group. I was a new professor at the time, and I had together with my students, my PhD students, we created this pick breeder system. And in that pick breeder system, the idea was you could see a bunch of pictures, and from the choices that you would see on the screen, you could choose one, and you could ask for it to have children, and then it would be as if it was like reproducing, and it would have children that are other pictures that look like it, because if just like if you had children, they would look a little like you, but they'd also look a little bit different. And this is the same as if we asked these pictures to have children. And then it's something that you could iterate. So like the user could then look at the children and from the children choose a child and ask it to have children. And then you get another generation. And so you could go generation by generation. And it's basically breeding is what you're doing. You're breeding. It's a breeding service. And it's just worth mentioning that like the reason that why would an AI professor want to create a picture breeding service? Like why is that? I feel like it's important to at least answer that a little bit. Like the reason that we thought we should do this, why we created this, is because we were really interested in open-ended discovery, like systems that continually generate novel discoveries. Things like biological evolution or also human civilization, they're both open-ended discovery processes. Like new inventions are constantly being created inside of civilization and new species in evolution. And we were interested in how things like that work. And of course, it's really important to understanding intelligence because, after all, civilization is a product of human intelligence. So we are open-ended. Like for whatever reason, humans are able to do this. We can continually discover things, and from the things we discover, we can discover even more things. And so what PickBreeder was an attempt to understand how systems like that work. So we thought by unleashing people on the internet, like crowdsourcing, as people called it then, crowdsourcing people to evolve pictures online, we would see an open-ended explosion of discovery like through this space of images, and that we would learn hopefully something deep. But I didn't know what, but I thought we might learn something. And in fact, though we did. So like at first it might seem like, what could you possibly learn? Like, what are you thinking about here? But I think the assumption that something was there was vindicated because we actually did learn something really, really deep, which is that we were looking at the discoveries people made. And by discovery, I mean like after a number of iterations of breeding, what you have after all that is kind of like a discovery. It's like something you found that exists in the space, but you wouldn't necessarily know it from the beginning. And there it is. So it's a discovery. And there were thousands and thousands of discoveries from hundreds or maybe even thousands of people who eventually used the system online. Um, and so we're looking through these and we're looking at the interesting discoveries, like things that looked like butterflies or cars or planets. And those are like interesting because they look like things in the real world. And here it's worth mentioning that the system didn't know anything about the real world. Like modern image generators like DALL-E or something, generative AI, it's pre-trained. So it sees data and it uses that data to figure out how to draw new pictures. This is not like that. The pick breeder had no pre-training whatsoever. So it means that the space that the people were breeding in was a space of mostly just random blobs, just garbage. And so if someone found something like a butterfly, it's actually a remarkable discovery because it's just through random mutations that somebody found a butterfly. And so we were interested in what is the explanation for these kinds of discoveries in this space? Because hopefully the explanation has something to do with the explanation for any open-ended process and how it works. And in some way, it's startling that there were any discoveries because, like I said, most of the space, 99.999%, was just garbage random blobs. And so looking at these interesting discoveries, like the butterfly or the car or the planet or the skull, like there's just lots of them. There were plenty of great discoveries. We would look back through the history that led to them because that's the cool thing about something like an online breeding service is like we have the records of everything. So it's like the whole tree of life, but instead of having to be archaeologists and dig in the dirt, we have it like in the computer in the database, so we can actually go back and see what happened. And so we did that. We would look at these discoveries and we'd go back and look and see what the history was. And we discovered something which I think was really profound, which is that it was always the case that when someone found something like that, they always started out not looking for it. So that's like the really weird thing. Like, in other words, there's a really deep fundamental principle inside Pick Breeder, which is that you can only find things by not looking for them. And actually, the original like inkling of this idea came when I had evolved something. Like I evolved a car in Pick Breeder. I was just a user using the service, and I realized to my own shock that I had discovered a car even though I had not been trying to get one. And what we discovered after that was this general principle that that's always the case. You would think that that is a huge coincidence at first. It's like, wow, you discovered a car in this like completely random space, but you're not even looking for it. But actually, that's always the story. Like that is the only way you can discover things. Why would that be? Is because the things that lead to these things, in other words, I call them like stepping stones. The stepping stones that lead to discoveries, they don't actually look like the discoveries. So, like, if you were looking for a car and you tried to choose things that look more like cars, you would fail because the things that lead to cars don't look like cars. It's very paradoxical and counterintuitive. And so, like, so where does this lead to novelty? So, like, I spent a lot of time trying to understand this principle. I believed that it was something really big. Like, I thought this was a huge discovery with profound implications. But at first, I wasn't sure what they were. But I knew, like, this is so crazy because it goes against everything I was ever taught. Like, I was always taught, like, the way you do things, this isn't just about Pip Reader, this is about life. Like, the way you accomplish something is you set a goal and then you move towards it. But Pip Reader is showing the exact opposite. Like all the greatest discoveries are from the people who weren't trying to move towards those things. And the people who were would fail. And so I was trying to like make sense of that. And I eventually realized that, the reason for this is that in complex spaces, which is like all interesting problems, the things that you want, that you're hoping to discover, they don't resemble the stepping stones that lead to them. In other words, it's going to be counterintuitive. It's like almost by definition, because think about it. If the stepping stones did resemble the final product, then by definition, it's an easy problem. And I'm talking about hard problems. Like if it's easy and you know what the stepping stones are, it would be solved. Like the whole reason it's not solved is we don't know what the stepping stones are. And the reason we don't know is because they don't look like what we'd expect them to be. It's actually a complicated problem. And so I started to think that this is actually a general principle in all complex spaces. Um, and if that's true, then like it would be interesting to try to formalize it like the way a computer scientist does into an algorithm. Like, can I describe a non-objective search process, a process that doesn't know where it's going, but still discovers interesting things? So, like, the question inside of that is, what is it? What is the principle that explains the choices that people made? If those choices are not actually driven by where they ended up, what are they driven by? And the answer is, I think it's the answer to this is a very deep answer. It's worth thinking about for a long time is interestingness. Like short of having an objective, like if you have two paths you can go down, generally you'll choose the one that you find the most interesting, even though you don't know where it leads. And so in Pick Breeder, this is what's happening is people are seeing a menu basically of possible images and they're choosing the one that they find the most interesting, at least the successful players. The ones who are not successful will choose the one that they think is leading to their objective, and then they'll hit a dead end and fail and find it frustrating. So it's these open-minded players that are doing the best. And so this is I said it's fundamental and deep because interestingness is a non-trivial idea. Like at first it might sound like it's just a kind of I'm just throwing off some kind of like informal concept, but the thing is that it's a very rich idea, rich concept. Like interestingness is non-trivial. Like a lot of people think I'm talking about randomness. It's like, well, if I don't have an objective, then I must be random. But that is not true. Interestingness is a computation that's based on your entire lifetime of experience. And what it means is that you're making actually very informed and very deep decisions when you choose something based on what you find interesting. But it's not the same as what I would choose because I have my own life experience that filters into what I find interesting. But either way, both of us are drawing on extremely rich information and data and an entire lifetime of experience. And so this leads to the question of novelty because when we were thinking like how are we going to formalize what people do in pick breeders so an algorithm could do it, like the problem is that it's very hard to formalize interestingness. It's like a perennial AI problem. Like the actual definition of interestingness or the formalization is just virtually impossible. Or you might say at least it's AI complete. Like it's like almost like you have to solve human intelligence before you can actually get the computer to know what's interesting, because it is a function of like truly understanding the world. I mean, it cannot be superficial. Like it has to be something deep. That's what interesting means. It's not superficial. And so it's like really, it's like even especially at that time, it was like impossible to formalize what it means to be interesting. But there's something that's a good proxy for it. It's not quite there, but it's good enough to get some traction. That's novelty. that's where novelty comes in. It's like if you want computers to be making choices that are not driven by objectives, but still driven by important and useful information, novelty is really good because it is much simpler to formalize than interestingness. Like, is this something new? I can formalize that because I can compare it to what I've seen in the past. But also, it's a proxy for interestingness because it's actually a fact that everything that's interesting is novel. The problem is that not everything that's novel is interesting. So it doesn't go both ways, but it's at least goes one way. And so it takes you close enough to what's interesting to actually make some discoveries. And so we can formalize novelty and we can create something called a novelty search algorithm. And then we can have the computer do pick breeder like exploration on its own. And that's where novelty came into the picture, and sort of eventually ends up in the book and having a prominent role because like it's fundamental to our ability to do anything interesting that we can actually think about and pursue novelty. Like if you can't, I mean, like I said, I conceded that there are things involved in interestingness that are outside of novelty. But if you can't actually understand novelty, you will never find anything interesting. Is the sensitivity to novelty is very important. This is why they're like, young people are very good at things like starting new fads, new fashions, like new ideas. Like those are all following paths of novelty. And it's very complex to be able to do that. It's a very hard thing. But these are promising gradients. They're not objective gradients because we don't know where we're going. Like when we follow a path of novelty, it's like you hear a new kind of music or something. It's just exciting. You have no idea where it's supposed to go. There's no goal. And so that's where novelty comes in. And novelty is basically the underlying explanation for discovery in large, complex spaces. And so it's a very important principle. And that's a long story of how I started to see that.
That is really inspiring because also when I think the concept how it's so like counterintuitive and how it's just kind of not everything is planned and will be planned. I think just accepting that concept, it's like it's truly inspiring and I feel like will impact so many people's lives because I think as you mentioned, most of us like were taught in school how to plan, how to organize, how to set goals, like weekly, monthly, yearly goals. But as you mentioned, maybe there are other paths out there that might not be expected, the concept of novelty. So my next question is, so based on the concept of novelty search, which is fascinating, can you provide an example of how this approach has led to unexpected and significant breakthroughs in your work or life?
Um, yeah, so the the I mean early on, actually first I just wanted to agree with you about no, like that this does mean something for people's lives. Like that's an important point because like that's a really weird point, because this is like AI research. And it's very unusual, I think, that anything comes out of AI research that like changes how you think about your life. I mean, other than the AI research, like you may think, oh, well, this LLM is cool, but that's the AI research itself. It's not like telling you should live your life differently. This is actually telling you something about how to live your life, which I think is just amazing. Like it took time for me to really absorb that and understand that because I only thought about AI research. That was what I considered to be my job. I wasn't there to critique how people run their lives or how institutions work, which are also very objectively driven. Like institutions in our culture, it's cultural and social critique, really. And so it took me a while to absorb that that's really the offshoot of this. But as I started to see that, I think it's like a kind of a beautiful thing, because like if you think about like if I tell you that following an objective can backfire, like a really ambitious objective, like let's say you want to be a billionaire. And so I might tell you, like, based on what I just explained to you, the stepping stones that lead to that probably don't resemble that. In other words, if you just go through a sequence of jobs that pay you more and more money, you're still probably never going to be a billionaire. The stepping stones don't resemble the final product. And so like at first it might sound like, oh, that's kind of pessimistic, it's almost like a sad lesson. Well, what are we left with? What can we actually do? But the thing is, you can also look at it as totally liberating because what it tells you is that you actually are principled if you just follow your interests. Like it's actually the right thing to do. It's like if you feel like hesitant, like, do I have a right to do this? Like, I don't know where this is going to lead. I don't know. Should I do this? Like, my parents are worried about this. This shows that that's more principled than going off and trying to be a billionaire. following your interest actually is something that you can feel like you have a right to do. And that to me just seems really liberating. It's really interesting. It comes out of AI research. But let me just caveat it like for one quick thing, just so people know, you do have to recognize there's risk involved. So that's important that like if it is sometimes safer to do something modest and set it as an objective. Notice that I only said this applies to ambitious objectives. Modest things, and modest things to me includes anything where the stepping stones are known, they can be achieved as objectives. And so modest doesn't necessarily mean easy. I mean, majoring in computer science, I would consider modest in the sense that we know what you have to do. It's like we know you need to go to college and we know what the classes you need to take. It's all known. So you know what the path is, you know what the stepping stones are. It's not easy, but it's modest in the sense it's known. So I'm saying what's risky is to do things where you don't have any idea what the stepping stones are. And so you don't have to do things like that. And pursuing your interest is that. So it's risky. But you won't do anything interesting in your life if you don't follow your interests. So that's the thing you have to realize is the trade-off. So anyway, you were asking about whether um, there are specific instances of this that have affected me in my life. Um, I so I would go on to give a meta story about that. This is a little bit circular, but I actually think even though it comes before that realization, that a really great story of this is Pick Breeder itself. This is very meta because Pick Breeder is what also led to the insight. But you have to, if you back up a little bit, you have to consider that the idea of creating Pick Breeder was a really, really weird idea for a professor in AI. Because what is it actually for? Like, what is the objective? You could ask. Like, why would you create a system for evolving pictures? Like, what is the deliverable that is going to provide value to to society? What's the scientific reason? What's the hypothesis scientifically? Like, I lacked every normal reason for doing this objectively. And this really came out in a stark way because when we submitted it for funding, which is generally what you do if you're like a professor, you try to get funding for your research. So we submitted it to an agency, like a funding agency, which is called the National Science Foundation in the U.S. to try to get money. And the main criticism and the reason that they declined to fund the project was that it wasn't clear what your objective is. So what is your objective? And so that is why you should not do this. I mean, that's they're literally saying we're not going to fund this. We don't want to pay for this because there's no objective. Like, but the thing is, like, I strongly believed, like, the reason I wanted to do it was because it was interesting and it was very novel and it was very interesting. So, like, I was just very interested in what will we see if we unleash the entire internet into an evolutionary art system? Like, we will learn something, but I don't know what it is, so I can't tell you. I can only tell you it's an interesting path to go down. And that was like obviously done before I had this philosophy or insight. But in hindsight, it's a great example of how important it is because if you think about it, if I had just followed the objective path and like taken to heart the rejection that I got from the funding agency, there would be no pick breeder. But then there would be none of this insight. And then we wouldn't be having this conversation today, and there'd be no book, and none of the things that my entire life had would have happened if I had not simply decided I'm going to do this because it's interesting and novel. Like that was an important decision and fundamentally life altering for me, and probably for more than just me, for all the people who read the book and for whom it meant something. It's all because I did something even though I wasn't sure what the objective was because I was just very confident that something interesting would happen. And so I think that's a great example, I think, of why this is so important. It's true though, it could have backfired. Like it could have been that we put this thing on the internet, it might have been fun or something, but nobody cared and we didn't learn anything. Then that's the risk. You know, you're taking a risk. There's no guarantees. But I think what you have to realize is that you can take several risks over a lifetime. You just have to make sure that they're not the kinds of risks that are going to destroy your life, obviously. So you want to have enough of a cushion. It's like I could afford to do Pick Breeder because I had several other projects going on that were funded. So that was my cushion. So I was willing to take a risk. And my students also, they had other projects going on but they just were so excited by Pip Breeder, they just decided to do it for free on the side. So that's why we ended up doing it. And so I'm not saying you should necessarily do anything for free, but I'm just saying you should find some reason that like this is actually a risk worth taking. It might be worth doing. It might even be worth it to you to do it if like it is if it is if you're completely unfunded, but you it's just your responsibility to take that risk. It's up to you whether you can, like Steve Jobs dropped out of college is like a classic example. So that's like a risk I wouldn't take. But for him, one of the first things he did was he took a calligraphy class after dropping out of college. But why would he do that? Because the thing is, he no longer matters whether it satisfies his major because he no longer has any objective. So it doesn't matter. So he just took it because it's interesting. Now, but that's a radical risk. Like I would not have done that because I personally would have felt too unsafe to not have a like some kind of degree. So when I go out into the world, I can get a job. But for him, he was willing to take that level of risk. So different people have different thresholds where they're willing to take risk, and it's really up to you what you think is like, the amount of cushion that you require before you go off and just pursue your interests.
That is really fascinating. So like knowing your thresholds. Also, I feel like it's kind of like having that metacognition of like how much risk you can have, and also seeing whether it's worth it. Or sometimes you wouldn't know actually, because just as you said, like Steve Jobs wouldn't know like before he dropped out, or maybe he did, but I feel like there are always risks, but at the same time opportunities out there. So how do we balance it? I think it's a lifelong journey that we all need to figure out. And thank you so much for sharing that. So next, we really wanted to, a lot of our students were really curious about your diverse career. So you've been involved in like several notable projects and startups, including being the co-founder and co-chief science officer of Geometric Intelligence, and also the head of core AI research at Uber AI, and also the open-endedness team leader at OpenAI. So how did your experiences with these ventures influence your current work and also your outlook on AI?
Let's see. So yeah, and before that, I was a professor before all that. So I definitely have a very diverse experience because I've seen like every single thing you could imagine. I mean, I've seen the academia, startup being acquired, working at an industrial research lab, and then, OpenAI is actually a very unique kind of research lab also. It's different from most, I think. And so like all of that, well, I guess I learned some lessons as like, it takes a long time to go through all that. So you have to get kind of older to be able to even see that much of the world. But at least I've learned some lessons with all that time that nothing's perfect, I guess, is the main thing, It's like you always kind of wonder if the grass is greener in some other manifestation of your career. It's like you're a professor. What would it be like in industry? Or maybe you chose to be in industry. So what would it have been like to be in academia? Or if you're working for a big company, then maybe I should be at a startup. And there's always like, well, what would it be like to be doing? And the answer is, of course, there's interesting things to learn by trying all that, but at the end of the day, nothing is perfect. There's some trade-off in all of those. And so it's like really just a question of like which parts of these trade-offs matter the most to you. It's like frustrating in some way that there's nothing completely perfect. At first I thought maybe I could move towards some perfect situation, but I started to see that like no matter what, there's trade-offs. Like at some point, like if you have a research career, which was my career, like the kind of dream, at least I saw in that, would be to have sort of unlimited funding to do whatever I want and no other responsibilities. Like that's a sort of like idealistic situation. None of the things that I mentioned are that. It's like you don't have that in any of these. Now, if something like some billionaire just gave me $1 billion and said, do whatever you want, like you don't even have to respond to me, you still have a problem though, because like you have to put together the team. It's like you have no administration, you have no support structure, you have no compute resources, like everything has to be assembled. So it's like nothing is really for free no matter what you do. And so you're trading something off for something else, like no matter what. And like for example, in academia, one thing that I really love is that PhD students are really truly fully committed in general, to what you decide to do with them. And one reason that they are is because they need to graduate. Like it's a sunk cost if they would leave in the middle. Of course, it happens sometimes, but there's a big incentive to not do that and to actually just see it through, which allows you to think really long term with like really smart young people. Like you can think 6 years in advance and think like, what kind of major project do we want to get into? Of course, it doesn't have to be objective, but it could be like, what kind of interest do you want to follow? And it can go a long, long way. And so that's a great thing. Um, but then, there are big downsides too there. Like the fact that you're constantly begging for funding. That's a huge downside of the academic world. Like every year, every project has got to get funded. And so go to industry and the problem is solved on the funding side. It's like when I went to Uber AI, it was just like amazingly liberating to just suddenly be like, I don't have to beg for money constantly for my project. Just what project you want to do? Okay, do it. And it's an amazing feeling. Um, but then the people there are less sticky. Like they're not like graduate students because maybe a better job comes along. Like there's nothing to complete. Like they're generally very accomplished, very smart people and with endless opportunities in the world. It's much harder to think long term, I think, or to assume that you'll be there in the long term. Industry is not just that the people might leave, but like there's constant restructurings, reprioritizations, like everything's changing. And then there's also like bottom line considerations of like what does the company need? Sometimes there's a luxury at some companies, like they have a true basic research function where you can really just pursue interests, but that's a luxury. They have to be doing really well to be able to support that. I think they should support that because that's actually a way of preventing disruption. It's like you need to do some research, but it's still a luxury. And so, because of that, like when times get hard, things can change. Academia has this beautiful thing that probably won't happen, and you can also kind of like totally control your destiny. It's like you just decide what you want to try to do, and then you get a chance to do it. And so there's those trade-offs. Like neither one is perfect in these ways. And so like I don't know which one I would recommend. It's like which side of the trade-off do you find more interesting? OpenAI is like its own thing too. Like, and so that really to me kind of illustrated the fact that there are different ways to run research labs in industrial settings. And OpenAI has I think, a fairly radical, unique culture, or at least had when I was there, which is probably different from anywhere, which is very willing to take risk, very willing to invest a lot in things that are uncertain, which really is actually consistent with my philosophy, um, and um, and also willing to drop things, which is a tough thing to do. Like they are willing to, like when they disbanded the robotics team, I don't think another lab would have done that. Like, because they were putting out good work. There were good papers being published out of that team. But OpenAI is able to be very single-minded and very tough, like in their decision making. And so, those interesting to watch that. But it's neither better or worse. It's just different, from the point of view of somebody working there, because obviously it's really cool that they're willing to take risks and invest in that kind of exploratory risk taking. But at the same time, anything can change on a dime. Like they could just disband your research group when they decide, actually, there's more interesting things to be doing. And so that wouldn't happen in other settings, most likely. And so I just think, you just have to look at the trade-offs. And the startup world is the last thing is the startup world is, of course, the startup world is a world of desperation, generally. It's like, how are you going to survive? So you a lot less of everything. Except the one thing is that you get to be like the king of your domain, right? Like, so that's the thing that's like really unique there. And there's one other thing I mentioned, just because maybe this will affect somebody at some level. Something that really struck me when I was working in geometric intelligence and looking at the possibility of being acquired by another company, um, was that I found the skills involved in like trying to sell a company, um, or even getting funding for a company at the beginning are actually similar to the skills involved in trying to get money for research as a professor, like writing grant applications, or what you call proposals. Like I found the skill set very similar, um, to be able to ask for investor money or acquire money as to ask for like science foundation money. But the thing that's interesting is that there's a huge orders of magnitude difference in the amount of money we're talking about. Like when you're talking about a professor asking for funding, you're talking probably hundreds of thousands in dollars, which I'm not saying that's a trivial amount of money. It's a lot of money. But the thing is, like when you're in a startup, you're talking like at least 10x that, right? Maybe 100x that. Like you're talking in the millions or more than millions. And and so what kind of hit me was just like it's not necessarily harder like to ask for 10x the amount of funding. or 100x. It's the same skill set. And it made me wonder why I was working so hard to ask for so much less, like as a professor. It's like it just takes as much work, as much stress. It's like, but you end up with like much less than you could get in this kind of startup setting. Well, that to me is not enough to say you shouldn't do academia because like there's zero job security on the startup side. Like it's extremely risky. Your life is on the line and your job is on the line. So like it's much better like if you want security to be in the academic setting. But you are talking about different scales of opportunity. And that was just interesting. So again, I'm not saying something's better or worse. It's just interesting to consider the different scales of what's possible, like when you apply that kind of skill set, like to actually trying to get funding for something. So yeah, my overall take home is just like there's trade-offs and pros and cons to everything and it just depends which ones you want. And maybe the last thing I put in here, just because from going through all this, it's worth telling young people about these pearls of wisdom that might take a long time to acquire on your own. Is that the other thing I found was that like it depends on where you are in life, what makes you the most happy. So it's not even a question of what's best for you. It's a question of what's best for you now, because like I loved academia, like absolutely, truly loved it, like with a passion. I loved being a professor. But then like I think I burned out to some extent during that time. It's a very stressful job. And being in industry was a source of relief. I really felt relieved. I really felt like I don't have to worry about like begging for funding constantly, teaching and grading constantly every semester, like a whole new set of students and a whole new set of grading, service activities, like committees, like it's just endless stuff you have to do. And like I said, I was in love with it. But the thing is, like my consciousness changed as I got older, and the things that made me feel good as a person changed. And so it's like I was a different person by the time I started working somewhere else. And so like I feel like it's not necessarily true that you're looking for the right thing for you because you're going to evolve. And it could be totally possible that like you could evolve in the opposite direction I did. Like you get sick of industry and want to go to academia. It's like all of us tend to get sick of things after long periods of time, many years. And you just need a change. And so it's not clear that there's like a singular thing that's the ideal thing for you. You just got to like find the right path, and you may go through multiple changes over that path.
That's definitely really helpful because I know, like, for young people in general, as you mentioned, it sometimes takes a long time, years, decades, for us to figure out like what's actually the right path. Or some people don't really figure out, or depends on what your purpose in life is. But I feel like that's definitely going to be really helpful for me, myself, and also a lot of my peers, because definitely seeing those different perspectives and how it's like working in different fields or academia is definitely really interesting. And it really sounds like you have a lot of exciting projects, which is so amazing. Yep. So currently you're working on Maven, a serendipity-focused social network. What inspired you to create Maven, and what are your goals for this platform?
The thing that inspired me was actually talking to people about our book for so many years, Why Greatness Cannot Be Planned. And it came out, the English version came out in 2015, so it's like 9 years old. And of course, there was a Chinese version more recently, Chinese language version. So I started to interact with people like in 2015, like who started reading the book, and so I had many, many years of talking to people about the principle, this like what I call the objective paradox, like the problem with setting objectives, which is kind of what the book is about, and serendipity, like the alternative to setting objectives, which is to pursue serendipity. And so I spent many years talking to people about these really social and cultural issues. Like I'm emphasizing that because as a computer scientist, it would be very unusual to talk to people about social and cultural issues. Like that's not really part of the job description as a computer scientist. But because we wrote this book, it just became part of my life to be able to have this opportunity to talk to people about how they felt about setting goals in their life, or not just their life, but how their company set goals, or their university set goals, or the government set goals, like whatever, all these different kinds of contexts where goals are really big. And people started talking to me about how they feel about that over years. And I started to understand something about the impact of this intensive, aggressive, objective-driven culture, which is worldwide right now, on people's psychology, and on human happiness and thriving. Like it just started to sink into me that there's a problem, but in a way that like I doubt anyone else on the planet has seen. Because like no one talks to all so many people about this. Like I'm the only person talking about this topic to such a wide diversity of people. And I got to talk to lots of diverse, like I mean, diverse is in like walks of life, ages, like professions. Like I talked to a huge diversity of people about this. And it's like just across the board something that is eating at people, because people are telling me that it's almost universal that people want me to know that they live their life in the serendipitous way. Like that's the first thing most people want me to know. It's like I don't live through objectives. I want to just do things because I like them and I find them interesting. Like I'm a free person, I'm a free spirit, and I just do things that are interesting. And I've always felt this way, but the world around me pushes against that. It doesn't want me to do that. I mean, we've all experienced this like through like even our childhood, because like children are the one exception where they can still live in a non-objective world. Like really young children, like before school even, like toddlers, like they take it, or even kids in a playground, like there's no objective in the playground. They don't need an objective. It's like, what are you going to accomplish today? There's nothing to accomplish. They just do whatever they find interesting. And that's like the way they live their life. And it's natural for a person to live their life that way. And we're arguing in the book that it's not just natural, but it's principled. Like it actually leads to more interesting outcomes. But as soon as you get to school, it's beaten out of you. Like you don't get to do that anymore because suddenly everything is objective because you have these grades and tests and you have to do well in these classes. And everybody tells you immediately, these are your goals in life. This is what matters. And it's like it's a really deep and profound impact that it has on people. And I think it's painful over time for all of us. Like for me, I remember like when I was in high school, like I remember having some ideas, like creative ideas. Like I just had random ideas sometimes. I'm sure everyone does. Like I'd be like, it'd be really interesting if somebody did this. But I remember explicitly having this thought that ideas are really just for fun. They're not really serious because you can't really get anything for them. It's like what actually matters is like doing what they tell you to do, like because you have to get good grades. So that's what matters. The ideas are just some like throwaway thing that you do, maybe have on the side, which is crazy. What kind of thought is that? It's like ideas are the thing that drive the world forward. Of course, ideas matter. But the fact that I could have got it in my head that actually ideas are just some like waste of time is absolutely crazy. I think a lot of us get that way. Like I didn't start to feel like an idea might actually help me until like the middle of my PhD. It was a really like nice feeling. Like when I suddenly realized that like actually my job suddenly is to have an idea. Like finally, at the age of like 24 or something, like finally somebody wants me to have an idea for real. And it might actually help me in my life. But I went through 24 years with no one caring whether I have an idea. Like that's not good for you. It's not healthy. No one's encouraging you to be creative. And so like I was thinking about this and like when this accumulates over years, like talking to people about this issue and seeing that it is hurting people and people are upset. I was thinking about it a lot after 9 years of this, that like, actually it was probably 7 or 8 years at the time when I started to think about Maven. But I was thinking a lot about it because of talking to so many people. And I was thinking about, you know, can anything be done about this other than just like talking? Because that's all I've been doing is just talk, talk, talk. And I started to think, I had this like, yeah, this epiphany that like maybe I could actually make a system that works the way that the world should work. Because like after all, like so far I'm just this like social critique, cultural critique. But the thing is, I'm an AI researcher. I was building open-ended systems. Like I didn't just like talk about philosophy. Like my job has always been I've been interested in building open-ended autonomous systems, like the novelty search algorithm or things that followed from it. And so I just thought maybe I could actually build a system that works this way. And then I realized that I must be talking about some weird kind of social network. I call it a serendipity network. But I was like, well, if there is a network that works that way, whatever that means, then there must be people in it and they must be transferring information back and forth among each other. And therefore, it's some kind of weird new social network. And then I realized that this other kind of big revelation that Oh, you know what's really weird that I hadn't really thought of even in the book is that social networks, like the way that the internet works today, are actually part of the objective paradox. Like they're extremely objective machines, which are meant to deliver maximal popularity. The objective is to get the most attention. And it's actually supposed to be quality, but that's the proxy. And as with all proxies for objectives, you get unintended consequences, deception. You get the things that the book talks about. You don't actually get to the objective because it's too ambitious. So you get some other things. And what do we get? We get like the things we every day here complaining about, like the toxicity and the echo chambers and the sensationalism, like the narcissism amplification, branding gone out of control, like nobody's a person anymore, everybody's a brand. Like it's all a side effect of the fact that we have this ridiculous universe-wide objective to get maximal attention. And that's what we've turned the entire world into. And like the more I thought about it, the more I felt like something maybe could be done because I actually have an alternative, because I understand a non-objective set of algorithms, like a world that doesn't work that way. And that's what made me think that, yeah, that's what became Maven. Maybe I could actually try. And I thought it was a crazy thing to try, but it's a crazy interesting thing to try. Like maybe it's possible to create an interest driven something where you pursue your interest and you don't pursue popularity. And it ends the popularity contest. And that's what led to the Maven idea.
I really love that sentence you mentioned. I'm a free person with a free spirit because I feel like nowadays it's so often that like we're in different institutions, different frameworks of life that we kind of sometimes forget that, which is crazy, I feel like, because it's your ideas, your creativity that's like what makes you as who you are. So I think I definitely really agree with your point about that. And that's a great perspective. And now
Well,
beyond AI.
oh,
Yeah, go
oh,
on.
sorry. I was just going to say on that, that it's kind of interesting that because I heard people say this so often
Mhm.
that I noticed that people often when people say that, they think they're unique. It's like, when they explain to me that they're a free spirit or however, whatever words they use, but they feel it's like they really want me to know that, like, this is who I am. I really am this way. But what I think everybody doesn't realize is most people are that want to be that way. It's like all of us think that we're the only person who wants to get out of this. It's
Mhm.
like, oh, but the world must love all this like objective stuff. Like everybody has this thing they have to accomplish. Like we're all being evaluated constantly. Like everybody thinks they're the only one who hates this, but actually everyone hates it. That's what I started to realize. I think it's really interesting. We are naturally free spirits, and like that's what we want. We want freedom and we want serendipity. We want to be released.
think I really love your idea because I feel like also the creation of becoming Global Students Association, a lot of people ask like, why you bring people from like all over the world from different schools? Like, what's the purpose of it? And then every time when I try to answer that question, I know like there's something deep down my heart. I know there's like this intuition, like how it all started, but I feel like the bottom like the fundamental part of it was driven by interest because I was just curious about how other people lived on the other side of the world, and because I did a lot of like exchange like at Peking University, Hong Kong University, Stanford, UCLA, so I kind of got to see the differences, but I was like it's nearly impossible if you're on the other side of the world to see like the other cultures, the people, how unique everyone is. So I was like, okay, so maybe it might be nice to bring together different people from different areas of the world. So but I've always
That's
been thinking
cool.
about it. I was like, why am I doing this even like with all my,
Uh-huh.
I don't know, homework,
Yeah.
research, study
Yeah.
plan, I don't know, application to grad school. I was like,
Yeah.
and people ask me like, why do you have time to do this? I'm like, maybe
It's
I don't,
interesting.
but it's driven by that.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
it's a good story.
Yeah. So thank you so much for also like letting me work around like my head, like why am I doing this even? But yes. Well, now beyond AI, how do you believe like your ideas on novelty and exploration can be applied to other fields such as like business, education, or scientific research?
Yeah, it has implications for all of that. Um, and so each kind of domain, like whether it's business or education or science or something else, philanthropy, there's all kinds of things, has a different maybe spin on how this objective paradox applies, but it does apply to basically everything. Because when you delve into any of those, you'll see that objectives are in charge. They're in charge of everything. And so, like, but then you have to see what the implications are from that. And so, like, for example, in the world of education, the objective is to maximize grades. And so from an individual perspective is to maximize grades, but also from an institutional perspective. So it's like a school's job is for the students to get the highest grade possible. So in effect, the real objective is for everyone to get 100. That's basically what the objective is. Now, this is a very ambitious objective because obviously that's almost impossible. How is everybody going to get 100? Like students have varying levels of skill and interest in different subjects. It's like, but it's still like we run the system as that's the objective. Standardized testing is used to figure out, are we moving along that objective? And that's called a metric. And it's something to recognize is that wherever there's objectives, you'll also find metrics. Metrics, I think of them as security blankets. They make you feel better because you're scared that you might be doing something wrong. So you have a metric. But you see, the reason it's a security blanket is because as pick breeder shows and in novelty search shows and further research shows, actually the most profound discoveries come from things where we didn't have the security blanket. And therefore, it's just a way of making you feel better because it's not going to lead to the greatest types of outcomes. So when it comes to education, we have this nice security blanket making us all feel better. That's intense, nonstop, standardized testing and just general testing also. One thing to consider is that maybe there's something interesting to try with the students, but it actually might not cause all the grades to go up. See, because like the point of like the objective paradox is that the stepping stones that lead to the things you want, which is everybody to do well, might not look like that. So that means that it might actually require us to traverse several stepping stones where grades don't go up or even go down a little bit in order to actually cross that river and find the other side where grades are way up because there was a fundamental like revolutionary insight along those steps, which is very interesting, but initially wasn't actually able to move the metric. Because like a lot of the time things that are very interesting need to mature before we actually see the ultimate implications. I mean, this is the fundamental like basis for doing basic research. Like basic research, like where it's like, well, what's the point of this? It doesn't make us any money at all. Well, yeah, but it might be a stepping stone. It might lead to something. But in the context of education, you have to understand that there are basic research that we could do. A teacher with their class could try something interesting. Now, I'm not suggesting to do crazy things, like things that would cause everybody to not become educated. Like that's bad, and that wouldn't be the point. But I'm saying try some things that might actually risk things not getting better initially. And if we never do that, we will never try anything interesting. I mean, guaranteed. And we will never see what we actually think is our objective, which is to see profound change in everybody's performance because it's going to require traversing what I call deceptive stepping stones, things that look like they're not actually leading to the objective. And so what we've done is we've handcuffed every teacher on earth to never try anything interesting because they can't risk the metric going down. Because after all, if the metric went down, they'll lose salary, they won't get promoted, they get fired. Like there's a million bad implications. The school won't get funding. So nobody can take any risks in education, which is why education will never, ever improve because of the objective paradox. So what is the alternative? And this is where you have to get creative. Like the alternative is not, oh, well, everybody can just do whatever they want. That's the straw man alternative. Like people think I'm saying, oh, well, teachers should just like, just do whatever they like and like we'll just like ignore them. Well, obviously that's dangerous. Like nobody will accept that. I'm not naive. Like the actual alternative is to be creative and think about this systemically carefully. And when I think about it in terms of education, this just is one example because there's all these other domains like you mentioned. But in education, what it leads me to is the idea that what the evaluation should not be through a standardized test, the global evaluation. Like we do need evaluation. I will concede that like in order to keep the system so that like kids do get an education, like nobody gets cheated, like some crazy teacher doesn't just like tell everybody to just draw pictures for a year. Like we need to make sure there's some form of evaluation, but we need to change it to not be so objectively standardized so that you can explore. So what should we do? I think we should say a teacher at the end of the year puts together a portfolio. The portfolio shows what tests she gave the students, shows the assignments she gave the students, shows some example of what the students did. And then that portfolio is shared with several peers, say 5 other teachers, not just in her own school, but across the country or the world even. And those teachers are peer reviewers. And this is borrowing from academic peer review. Like the peer reviewers then could say, does anything look amiss here? And if it does, then we could do a standardized test. Like that's the only point where I would say like go back, because then maybe if there's something really bad going on, we need to make sure that like just basic level skills are not being destroyed. But short of that, the peer review is the assessment. And so the teacher is considered to be passed if the peer reviewers say that they're good enough. And so it's no longer metric driven. And the effect of this is that stepping stones will proliferate through the academic system. See, because imagine if the teacher had an interesting idea. Now it has been exposed to all the peer reviewers. So five people know about that interesting idea. Now, if they find it interesting, they can try that idea. It may not have raised grades, but it gets to proliferate. People get to elaborate on it. And we've created a new kind of social network where ideas are proliferating through a network of teachers now without some global standardized thing that's going to kill anything and kill it at the start. And we actually get to have the percolation of new stepping stones and new ideas and interesting thoughts through a system, through peer review. And it would be completely different. And you would see actual innovation in the educational system. And it's not based on following like a single objective metric. And so I mean, I don't, maybe I shouldn't answer for every domain, but I think that example shows you that you can rethink a lot of these systems in a non-objective way to get something really different, but still not destroy the whole system and have to like go back to zero.
Mm. That's definitely fascinating. Like sometimes it's actually not about improving grades, but maybe, as you said, that might improve maybe an aspect of someone's life in the future and give them new ideas, which might be even more important than grades in the short term. So I think that's definitely something we should try. And real quick, last question. So many of our audience are students, young professionals, or young researchers from around the world. So what advice would you give to those who are either starting their journey in AI and innovation or just in life being a young person? Do you have any advice for them?
Okay, yeah. I mean, I guess I feel like almost this whole discussion almost has a lot of implicit advice, obviously.
Mhm.
So it's sort of like, I could just echo what I've been saying that like, at some point it's okay to follow your interests. In fact, it might actually be important to follow your interests. I think that's often what's lost in early life, young life, is that you used to care about following your interests. It used to be the primary thing when you were a tiny little kid, like on a playground. But you've had that beaten out of you now, and it's leads you to think that like anytime you start daydreaming about something that might be interesting for you to do in your life or in your profession, that you need to shut it off right away, because it's just crazy. Like it doesn't satisfy the objectives that you have. And your objectives are coming from all over the place. Like you have personal objectives. You also have objectives coming from your university or your company. So you have academic objectives. Also, your parents are setting objectives for you. And so, like all of those objectives, like have a very strong force pushing you away from just daydreaming and following serendipity and interest and stuff like that. And so it's important, I think, to open up that part of you, which still exists because it's the most natural part of being human, and find it again. But then when you do, like just the other part of the advice is you should remember that, and I said this, that it entails risk. Like one thing is don't be naive. I don't think I'm naive telling you just go do what's interesting because that's just on its own naive. You have to also take into account the risk that's involved. Like, so Steve Jobs could drop out of college and take calligraphy because I'm assuming he was willing to take on that risk. And that's important. Like, if you're not willing to take on the risk, you shouldn't do it. Like, it's not shameful to do things that are modest. It's not shameful to just major in something and get a job and have a safe, steady salary and have a family. No shame at all. So it's this is really about preferences. Like when you follow the path of the interesting, you're taking a risk by definition, and it's just up to you whether it's worth it to you. But you shouldn't think of it as a guarantee. It's not like, oh, well, if I follow my interest, then everything will fall into place. A lot of the time, it doesn't work out because it involves risk. But the thing you have to remember is you won't do anything interesting if you don't do anything interesting. That's the problem. So you can have a nice, safe life, but it won't be fundamentally like transformative, if you never follow your interests. And so, like, as a compromise, what I tend to do is try to find a cushion so that I can do some things because they're interesting, but I also created a situation where it's not going to be devastating if it doesn't work out. So that's like for me getting my college degree. Like I wasn't going to drop out and just do what I found interesting because I wanted to have a cushion so I knew I could get another job. Or even for me, it was becoming a professor because I knew that a professor's job is to take risks. Like I'm supposed to try several projects. If one of them fails, I'm still okay because I have other projects. And so I don't have all my eggs in one basket. And so that's sort of risk averse in a way, like to have to go all the way through a PhD and get a job as a professor before you really start taking risks. But it's just, I have that threshold. Some people would never go to any level and take risks. Like a lot of people, they'll major in accounting and they'll just do their job for like 50 years, and that's perfectly respectable. But they don't want to take any risks. And so at least I personally had some room in me to take some level of risk, but I needed some level of cushion to feel comfortable with it. And so the project for you is to find that level for yourself because everybody's different in their tolerance for risk. And you'll see like a lot of the most successful people in the world are the people who took the biggest risks, but also a lot of the people who are the least successful are also the people who took a lot of huge risks, right? Because like they're basically don't have a degree and don't have a job and don't have any money. And so it's a matter of personal preference and tolerance. But I think you're young, so you do have the privilege of time on your side. So you can afford to have a couple of failures in your life. And so it might be sad if you look back and think, I never took any of those risks that I wanted to take, things that seemed interesting, but I didn't know. And by the way, this is not just about professional, this is about every aspect of life, personal too. And so it's just something to think about. And the fact that, like, ultimately, if you read the book, you'll see that it actually is principled to follow the path of the interesting. It's not random. And so you do have a right to do it as long as you understand and accept the risks.
Mm. White greatness cannot be planned. Thank you so much for your insights, Ken. Your ideas are truly incredible and really inspiring, and I'm sure our audience will gain a lot from this conversation. Thank you so much for today. So,
Thank you. Thank
Ken
you, Elena.
Stanley,
It's great to talk to
everyone.
you.
Yay. Thank
Thanks a
you.
lot. Okay.
Yeah.